have the time and take a stroll in your mind. In August of '64, a Tonkin Gulf incident ignites a war. Admiral Morrison gets attacked, then America strikes back. Weird scenes inside the canyon. Weird scenes inside the canyon. Military kids depart the hill, and into the canyon they will fill. They protest people who kill, but are they any different still? Weird scenes inside the canyon. Weird scenes inside the canyon.
Welcome to my summary of the book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. This is Part 6, Chapter 8, All the Young Turks. Since this video series is based on a book, it's best to start at the beginning. I'll leave a link to Chapter 1 and a pinned comment. Thanks for watching, and please share. Chapter 8, All the Young Turks, Hollywood Tripping.
As all halfway decent managers in the rock era have done, Jim Dixon worked on seducing the in-crowd and creating buzz around the birds. The timing was perfect. Los Angeles' baby boomers were mobile, getting around, looking for action, and now they were joined by the hip elite of Hollywood itself, from Sal Mineo and Peter Fonda to junkie comic Lenny Bruce.
Barney Hoskyns, writing in Waiting for the Sun. As important as the Freaks were to building an audience for the new Laurel Canyon bands, there was another group that played a key role as well, Hollywood's so-called Young Turks. Like the Freaks, the Turks became an immediate and constant presence on the newly emerging Sunset Strip scene. As with the Freaks, their presence on the Strip was heavily promoted by the media. Locals and tourists alike knew where to go to gawk at the Freaks and, as an added bonus, quite possibly rub shoulders with the likes of Peter Fonda, Jack Nicholson, Bruce Dern, Dennis Hopper, and Warren Beatty, along with their female counterparts such as Jane Fonda, Nancy Sinatra, and Sharon Tate. As with the Freaks, the Turks were instrumental in distracting away from the less than stellar musicianship on the stage. After all, young men offered the chance to see Jane Mansfield in the flesh probably didn't even notice whether there was a band on stage at all. Mansfield, by the way, like Mansonites Susan Atkins and Bobby Beaujolais, had direct ties to Anton LaVey and his Church of Satan. Many of these young and glamorous Hollywood stars forged very close bonds with the Laurel Canyon musicians. And the author states that they passed around John Phillips' wife, Michelle, to everybody in the canyon, sounds like. Some of the actors, like Warren Beatty and Jack Nicholson, never left the canyon. From the symbiotic relationship between Laurel Canyon actors and Laurel Canyon musicians arose a series of feature films that are now considered countercultural classics. One such film was The Trip, which came out in 1967. It is an unintentionally hilarious attempt to create a cinematic facsimile of an LSD trip. Written by, of all people, Jack Nicholson, the movie starred fellow Turks Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper, and Bruce Dern. Seated in the director's chair was Roger Corman, who, throughout his career, worked side by side with David Crosby's dad on no less than 23 feature films. Recruited to supply the soundtrack for the film was Graham Parsons' International Submarine Band. Parsons' music, however, was ultimately not used, though the band does make a brief on-screen appearance. The house where most of the film was shot, at the top of Kirkwood Drive in Laurel Canyon, became the home of Love's Arthur Lee. Another psychedelic cult film of the late 1960s with deep roots in Laurel Canyon was the Monkees' 1968 big screen offering Head. Also scripted by Nicholson, with the assistance from Bob Rafelson. The movie included cameo appearances by canyon dwellers Dennis Hopper, Jack Nicholson, and Frank Zappa. The music, performed of course by the Monkees, was a mix of songs written by the band and contributions from Canyon songwriters like Carole King and Harry Nilsson. Shockingly, some of that music is actually pretty good. Even more shockingly, the movie overall is arguably the most watchable of the 1960s cult films. It is certainly a vast improvement over, for example, 1968's wretched Psych Out, starring Nicholson and Dern. I do realize, by the way, that some of you out there in Readerland cringe every time that I mention the Monkees as though they were a real band. The reality, though, is that they were every bit as real as most of their contemporaries. And while the made-for-TV Beatles replicants were looked down upon by music critics and fans alike, they were fully accepted as members of the musical fraternity by the other Laurel Canyon bands. The homes of both Mickey Dolenz and Peter Tork were popular Canyon hangouts in the late 60s for a number of real musicians. Also regularly dropping by Dolen's party house were Dennis Hopper and Jack Nicholson. The difference in perception between their peers and the public was attributable to the fact that the other bands knew something that the fans did not. The very same studio musicians who appeared without credit on the Monkees albums also appeared without credit on their albums. And then, of course, there were the fact that so many of these Laurel Canyon real musicians had taken a stab at being part of the Monkees, including Stephen Stills, Love's Brian McLean, and Three Dog Night's Danny Hutton, all of whom answered the Monkees' casting call and were rejected. Despite persistent rumors, however, there was one local musician who we can safely conclude did not read for the part. Charles Manson. Given that the show was cast in 1965 and began its brief television run in 1966 while Charlie was still imprisoned at Terminal Island waiting his release in the March of 1967, there doesn't appear to be any way that Manson could have been considered for part of the show. And that's kind of a shame when you think about it, because if he had been, we might today remember Charlie Manson not as one of America's most notorious criminals, but rather as the guy who made Marcia Brady swoon. Returning to the counterculture films of the 1960s, the most critically acclaimed of the lot, and the one with the deepest roots in Laurel Canyon, was Easy Rider. Directed by Dennis Hopper from a script co-written by he and Peter Fonda, the film starred Fonda and Hopper along with Jack Nicholson. Hopper's walrus mustachioed character in the film was based on David Crosby, who was regularly seen racing his motorcycle up and down the winding streets of Laurel Canyon. That motorcycle, by the way, had been a gift from Crosby's good buddy, Peter Fonda. Fonda's absurd Captain America character was inspired by either John Phillips' writing partner, Graham Parsons, or by Crosby's former bandmate in the Byrds, Roger McGowan, depending upon who's telling the story. That very same Roger McGowan scored the original music for the film. His contributions were joined on the soundtrack by offerings from the fellow Canyonite musicians Steppenwolf, the Byrds, Fraternity of Man, and Jimi Hendrix. And the movie's hippie commune was reportedly created and filmed in the canyons near Mulholland Drive. Since Easy Rider has such deep roots in the Laurel Canyon scene, we need to briefly focus our attention here on one other individual who worked on the film, art director Jeremy Kay, aka Jerry Kay. Before Easy Rider, Kay had worked on such cinematic abominations as Angels from Hell, Hell's Angels on Wheels with Jack Nicholson, and Scorpio Rising, Kenneth Anger's occult-tinged homage to gay biker culture. In the mid-1970s, Kay would write, direct, and produce a charming little film entitled Satan's Children. Of far more interest here than his film credits, though, is his membership in the 1960s in a group known as the Solar Lodge of Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO, which found itself in the news, and not in a good way, just after Easy Rider opened on the theater screens across America. 2 weeks after Easy Rider premiered on July 14, 1969, police acting on a phone tip raided the Solar Lodge's compound near Blythe, California, and found a 6-year-old boy locked outdoors in a 6-by-6-foot wooden crate in the sweltering desert heat. The young boy, whose father was a Los Angeles County probation officer, had been chained to a steel plate for nearly 2 months in temperatures reaching as high as 117 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, I'm not going to discuss in detail what they did to this poor kid, but let me just say it's pretty terrible what he says in the book. If you want to, look it up yourself and read it, but it's pretty horrible. 11 adult members of the sect were charged with felony child abuse, the majority of them young white men in their early 20s. All were brought to trial and convicted. In a curious bit of timing, the raid that resulted in the arrest and convictions coincided with the torture and murder of musician Gary Hinman by a trio of Manson acolytes. Various sources have claimed that Manson had ties to the group, OTO, which also maintained a home near the USC campus in Los Angeles. There is no doubt that Charlie preached the same dogma, including the notion of an apocalyptic race war looming on the horizon. The massacre at the Tate residence occurred less than 2 weeks after the raid on the OTO compound. Manson's Barker Ranch hideout would be raided a few months later, on October 12, 1969. The birthday, as I may have already mentioned, of Aleister Crowley, the grand poobah of the OTO until his death in 1947. Anyway, sorry about that little digression, folks. I'm not entirely sure how we ended up at the Barker Ranch when the focus of this chapter was supposed to be on the Young Turks. So, having now established that those Turks were a fully integrated part of the Laurel Canyon Sunset Strip scene, and also that they played an important role in luring the public out to the new clubs to check out the new bands, our next task is to get to know a little bit about who these folks were and where they came from. Let's begin with Mr. Bruce Dern, who has some of the most provocative connections of any of the characters in this story. It's probably safe to say that Dern's parents had rather impressive political connections. Baby Bruce's godparents were sitting First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and two-time Democratic presidential nominee Adlai Stevenson. Bruce's paternal grandfather was George Dern, who served as the Secretary of War, which would today be Secretary of Defense, under President Franklin Roosevelt. George had also served as governor of Utah and the chairman of the National Governors Association. Bruce's mother was Jean McLeish, who happened to be the sister of Archibald McLeish, who also served under Franklin Roosevelt as the director of the War Department's Office of Facts and Figures and as the assistant director of the Office of War Information. In other words, he was essentially America's Minister of War Propaganda. Perhaps the most impressive item on his resume, however, was his membership in everyone's favorite secret society, Skull and Bones. It would appear then that even by Laurel Canyon standards, Mr. Dern has friends in very high places. Let's turn our attention to the next guy who shared the screen with Dern in The Trip, Mr. Peter Fonda. Of course, we all know that Fonda is the son of good old Hank Fonda, lovable Hollywood liberal and all-around nice guy. And certainly even a Crontarian such as myself would not be so bold as to suggest that Henry Fonda might have some skeletons in his closet, right? Just for the hell of it, though, here are a few chapters of the Hank Fonda saga that we should probably review here. Hank served as a decorated U.S. Naval Intelligence officer during World War II, thus sparing Peter the stigma of being the only member of the Laurel Canyon in crowd not to have been spawned by a member of the military intelligence community. Not too many years after the war, Hank's wife, Frances Ford Seymour, who claimed to be a direct descendant of Jane Seymour, the third wife of King Henry VIII, was found with her throat slashed open with a straight razor. Peter was just 10 years old at the time of his mother's alleged, that thing people do to themselves that starts with an S, on April 14, 1950. Fonda rebounded quickly from Seymour's unusual death, and within 8 months he was married once again to Susan Blanchard, to whom he remained married until 1956. In 1957, Hank married yet again, this time to Italian Countess Aldria Franchetti, who followed up on her 4-year marriage to Fonda with a rumored affair with the newly sworn-in President John Kennedy. Franchetti, it turns out, is the daughter of Baron Ramodio Franchetti, who was a consultant to fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. The Countess is also the great-granddaughter of Louise Sarah Rothschilds of the Rothschild banking family. Perhaps you've heard of them? Before moving on, I should probably mention that Hank's first wife, Margaret Sullivan, who was yet another child of Norfolk, Virginia, also allegedly committed that thing that people do themselves that starts with an S on New Year's Day, 1960. 9 months later, her daughter, Bridget, followed suit. In 1961, very soon after the deaths of first her mother and then her sister, Sullivan's other daughter, Brooke Hayward, walked down the aisle with the next young Turk on our list, Dennis Hopper. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Hopper's body of work, he is the guy who was once found wandering naked and bewildered in a Mexican forest. And the guy who, after divorcing Hayward in 1969, married Michelle Phillips on Halloween Day 1970. only to have her file for divorce just 8 days later, claiming that Hopper had kept her handcuffed and in prison for a week while making unnatural sexual demands. Without passing judgment here, I do think it's fair to say that Michelle Phillips had been around the block a time or two, if you catch my drift. So, even if she thought Hopper's demands were a bit over the top, then one can only wonder just how unnatural they might have been. For what it's worth, Hopper once told a journalist that he didn't handcuff her, he just punched her out. In his mind, apparently, that made him somewhat less of a troglodyte. Most official biographies of Hopper would lead one to believe that he was the son of a simple farmer. Dennis acknowledged that was clearly not the case. My mother's father was a wheat farmer, and I was raised on their farm, but my father was not a farmer. To the contrary, Hopper's dad was a working person in intelligence who, during World War II, was in the OSS. He was in China, Burma, and India. Hopper has proudly proclaimed that his father was one of the 100 guys that liberated General Wainwright out of prison in Korea. After the war, according to Hopper, his dad routinely carried a gun, which I suppose is what most lay ministers in the Methodist Church do. The family also left the farm in Kansas and relocated to San Diego, California. The author lists a whole bunch of military installations in that area, and I can say from personal experience, my dad worked at North Island Air Base. There's nothing but Navy and Marines in that area. It's definitely a military town. Other than that, though, San Diego is just a sleepy little beach town where Hopper's dad ostensibly worked for the post office. The more recent incarnation of Dennis Hopper, by the way, was widely at odds with the hippie image that he had at one time tried very hard to cultivate. Before his death on May 29, 2010, Hopper was unapologetically a cheerleader for right-wing causes, who proudly boasted of having voted straight Republican ticket for over 30 years. To briefly recap then, we have thus far met 3 young Turks, and we have found one of them to be the nephew of a bonesman. Another is the son of a naval intelligence officer who was once married to a Rothschild's descendant. And the third was a slightly deranged son of an OSS officer. Come to think of it, we've actually covered one of the Turkettes as well, since Jane Fonda obviously came from the same family background as her younger brother, Peter. As for the other female members of the posse, Sharon Tate was the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tate, a career U.S. Army intelligence officer. Nancy Sinatra is, of course, the daughter of Francis Albert Sinatra, whose known associates included Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Sam Giancana, Carlo Gambino, Gaetano Luigi, and Joseph Frschetti, a cousin of Al Capone. Frank Sinatra was also a client of hairdresser to the stars Jay Sebring, as was Henry Fonda, who, at one time, strangely enough, lived in the guest house of 10050 CeeLo Drive. Yet another client of Sebring's was the next young Turk on our list, Warren Beatty, whose father, Ira Owens Beatty, was ostensibly a professor of psychology. Young Warren, however, spent all his early years living in various spooky suburbs of Washington, D.C. He was born in Richmond, Virginia in 1937, after which his father moved the family to Norfolk, Virginia, which is the world's largest naval facility. The family later relocated to Arlington, Virginia, the home of the Pentagon, where Warren attended high school and where he was known on the football field as, recalls John Phillips, who attended a rival school, Mad Dog Beatty. The author speculates that Warren's dad is something other than what he appears to be. His family's relocations always seem to land a family in D.C. suburbs that are of considerable significance to the military intelligence community. It wouldn't require a huge leap of faith to further speculate about what type of work he was doing, given that the wholesale co-opting of the field of psychology by the MK Ultra program and affiliated projects. The next young Turk up for review is the one who went on to become arguably the most acclaimed actor of his generation, Mr. Jack Nicholson. Before getting to him, though, let's take a look at a biographical sketch of serial killer Ted Bundy as presented by Wikipedia. I put the Wikipedia page up on the screen. You can stop it and read it if you'd like, or look it up yourself. Now, if we just change a few names here and there, we come up with an accurate bio of Jack Nicholson, which goes something like this. Nicholson was born at some indeterminate location to an underage unwed showgirl. The identity of his father remains a mystery. To avoid social stigma, Nicholson's grandparents, John Joseph and Ethel Nicholson, claimed him as their own son. In taking their last name, he became John Joseph Nicholson, Jr. He grew up believing his mother, June Frances Nicholson, to be his older sister. Reporters state that he learned June was actually his mother in 1974, when he was 37 years old. By then, June had been dead for just over a decade, having only lived to the age of 44. It has been said that Nicholson was born at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, but there is no record of such a birth either at the hospital or in the city's archives. As it turns out, Jack Nicholson has no birth certificate. Until 1954, by which time he was nearly an adult, he did not officially exist. Even today, the closest thing he has to a birth certificate is a certificate of delayed report of birth that was filed on May 24, 1954. The documents list John and Ethel Nicholson as the parents and identifies the location of the births as Nicholson's home address in Neptune, New Jersey. It appears then that there is no way to determine who Jack Nicholson really is. He has told journalists that he has no interest in identifying who his father was, nor would it appear in verifying his mother's identity. I should probably also mention here that Henry Fonda scored his first acting gig through Dorothy Dodie Brando, the director of a local theater and the mother of Jack Nicholson's future neighbor, Marlon Brando. Truth be told, the families had likely had close ties for a long time, a very long time. The ancestors of both Marlon Brando and Henry Fonda, you see, arrived in New York at nearly the same time, roughly 3.5 centuries ago. Henry Fonda is the direct descendant of Dutch colonists who arrived in New York circa 1650 and settled near now what would become Albany. He came to America on a ship that was owned by a wealthy Dutchman, Mr. Van Rensselaer. And I know I butchered that name. If you've been paying attention, you'll recall that there happened to be the bloodlines one day would produce a guy named David Van Cortlandt Crosby. It would appear then that Peter Fonda kind of owed David Crosby that Triumph motorcycle that he gave him back in the 60s. What with David's ancestors having been cool enough to give Peter's ancestors a lift over to the New World and all. Let's wrap up this chapter with a quick review of what we've learned about the people populating Laurel Canyon in the mid to late 1960s. We know that one subset of residents was a large group of musicians, all who decided nearly simultaneously to flood into the canyon. The most prominent members of this group were, to an overwhelming degree, the sons and daughters of the military intelligence community. We also know that mingled in with them were the young stars of Hollywood, who also were, to an astonishing degree, the sons and daughters of the military intelligence community. And finally, we know that also in the mix were scores of military intelligence personnel who operated out of the facility known as Lookout Mountain Laboratory. I've got to say that, given the relatively small size of Laurel Canyon, I'm beginning to wonder if there was any room left over for any normal folks who might have wanted to live the rock and roll lifestyle. And that brings us to an end of Chapter 8, All the Young Turks. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next episode of
Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon.
Hey, if you made it this far, please like, subscribe, comment, and most of all, share. This was a fun episode to make, and I didn't know all those things about those Hollywood stars that are said in this video. Anyways, I can't say it enough. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Military kids depart the hill, and into the canyon they will fill. They protest people who kill, but are they any different still? Weird scenes inside the canyon. Weird scenes inside the canyon.